Hello all. This video is going to be another installment of my Generalities series where I basically just muse over recent topics in a kind of quarterly fashion, if you will, if you're new to the channel. And so I suppose to start out we would look, of course, at the Russia and Ukrainian conflict. Um, and I think, and I mentioned this in my last video, that I think one of the more interesting things to pick up on the crisis so far in the clips you can see is how this sort of old machinery, industrial warfare seems to not really hold up with in terms of like tanks and this sort of giant machinery that was used in the past century is really just being a sort of as really a means for, it seems, for these nations to just dispel of infamously, of course, we left all that ton of machinery in the Middle East in the botched in the when we pulled out of Afghanistan. And so I think it's kind of interesting to see this sort of warfare seemingly go to the wayside as modern techniques continue to manage and wage war in a sort of new way that could be looked at really through the telecommunications with the global internet. We see the claim of intelligence groups saying outright that the way in which the global empire, if you will, is able to communicate to the front lines of this conflict is, of course, never before seen. And so this sort of new change towards war as a whole is, of course, interesting, especially if you're looking for a kind of historic way of looking at history as a whole, as many thinkers do. And I think it's also it would be good to maybe couple this with the so-called Putin price hike. This obviously seems more in fashion with Joe Biden and the Democrats largely just trying to circle the wagons and blame really the really self-destructive attitude of the last couple years of throwing the economy largely against the wall, and of course the state of the inflation issue comes to mind, and the trillions that have been printed off, of course. But it's also interesting to look that, after these sanctions have come to be in the last couple months, it seems that Russia still has found a way to supply its energy demands throughout through different ways than and finding new deals across the EU to continue to funnel energy. The economic situation, the price hike, the state of the inflation ongoing, perhaps crisis, and now we're hearing about food shortages, of course. This is being presented in such a way that this is the price, of course, for democracy, the price to pay to have this democratic superstate across the world in this global way, that any sort of misstep and miscalculation could result, of course, in momentum shifting in the other direction. And I think you're beginning to see that, of course, with other nations, other geopolitically aligned with sort of the client dependency on energy and whatever the case may be. That's being challenged in a way that we haven't seen since the so-called end of history. And so it's interesting how back home, of course, which is classic problem with empires, is the domestic population turning away from this the imperial projects of the elite, if you will. And so it's interesting to look at a thinker like Carl Schmitt, perhaps, and what he has to say about democracy and its ultimately paradox and agency against the will of the people, and how over time it won't be represented, and the sort of people that were aligned with former states of exception, former claims of normality, which I think is I think Schmitt totally knocked it out of the park with the pandemic crisis, when he talks of the state and authority and what normality and the state of exception is. I think he knocked it completely out of the park. And I think another example of that is now when we see towards Chinese politics and Shanghai and the shortages and lockdowns that are continuing to ongo, and the horrific clips. Although, we have to always take these clips with somewhat of a grain of salt to some degree. After all, these sort of clips was originally what propelled the response to begin with in 2020. If you really look back, and a lot of these clips, they didn't really age well if you really look back at them now, and it's kind of interesting to see it in that sort of lens without 2020 dialogues now, the gift of hindsight, if you will, and see how poorly made some of these clips were. But it does appear that we do see people just committing suicide from the conditions of this. And I think it's interesting to perhaps throw a wrench in here in the analysis of the West and Chinese politics by and large, and consider that the transfer of power, how we see it in the Anglosphere, it isn't a truly exceptional tradition that is often taken for granted and not factored in politics of across the world. And I think that's true for the way we look at Jinping and his sort of strategy. He is in a much more dire life and death situation, I think, than most Anglo politicians would ever consider. Coming at a figure around here is way more in line with reputation and the legal system, and holding suit with office and maintaining that power. You think of something like that, whereas that perhaps isn't the geopolitics of other states. And I think that's certainly something to consider with how the Chinese are acting right now, with Xi looking to maintain power. The zero COVID strategy seems to be what he needs to double down on, at least, or so he sees. And I think that's something to consider when we look at Shanghai and what to make of it. But I think on the Western side, though, in our media, I think these clips, though, will be used to kind of memory hole our own mistakes, and we'll look at China's reaction and ongoing reaction as, this is insane and, a human rights error. But of course, this downplays our own human rights errors that we did in response. And I think it's interesting to and important to point out that sleight of hand that I think you'll see over time. But of course, the big topic that everyone's talking about, though, is Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, which of course deserves a monicum of respect for just bravery alone. Um, it's kind of interesting to consider, capital and these sort of most powerful people in the world. Ultimately, though, no one really just wants capital for the sake of just having capital or material comfort, but it is to, put on your sort of abstract ideology onto the world. It's the means, it's not the ends. And I think really that is, the great Trojan horse, if you will, of capitalism and the natural sort of order and arguments that we see in politics and in theory, which is that capital ultimately, though, for these sort of men in power, maintaining that interest really seems to become quite secondary, as opposed to actually, putting on your ideas into the world, whether it's, abstractly maintained or in a sort of, in a way that is actually materially maintained, if you will. And so whether or not you think that the importance of capital, though, it ultimately, though, is a means for the political. And I think that kind of goes with what Aristotle, in addition to what he says about, the character of a people who put that sort of factional interest of capital, of market men in charge. But more than that, though, it's that it's just a faux pas. It doesn't seem to be genuine. There is this sort of mythos among lower class people. I am one of where is that sort of high class billionaire who he just maintains his empire. He just continues to invent things, continues to he's not evil. Let's not paint him as just some tycoon, heartless tycoon. Like, say he's doing the proper things, proper capitalist, smart, just like Elon, and making the world a better place, providing something for people. But still, though, a person doesn't exist because I don't think that's within our human nature of, if we are given the opportunity, through capital, perhaps, to actually, stand for something like, in this case, free speech, something abstract like free speech. Not that there's a problem with that, perhaps, here, but, it's these principles, it's these ideas, if you want to look at it in a history of philosophy critique way here, as I've been doing on the channel with when we pass through Hegel and Marx, is that ideas, to me, certainly do drive men and history, not just great men, but all men, and certainly the capital class. I think that's really the critique of it all, really, when it comes to just capital as a whole, as it seems, most people are just focused on this sort of resentment of them making more, but it's more about the sort of discreteness of the power dynamics of it, and that there really isn't just this sort of, capitalist who just keeps his head down and just maintains money, but doesn't participate in this sort of factional interest of the greater political order and at hand. And I think it's just a total myth that we tend to think of as people who aren't these people, But I do have some concerns with what Elon has been saying, though, in regards to his sort of veiled threats towards internet anonymity, which is, of course, very important and vital to this sphere and the internet at large, and very important for the virtual, as I've talked about. Because I think, humor and, its cultural importance here in this time of being able to say what you actually think or feel through, satire. This is the new territory and, possibilities that come out of these events that seem to reoccur with, where it seems, almost a cliche now where, our satire, it seems, ends up becoming exemplified in the real world. So where we have, these sort of virtual predictions, if you will, end up actually happening in the real world, or we end up seeing this position in the end. And this is because I think we're changing culture through this sort of satire of pressing the position of these possibilities. And one of those things is, of course, out of anonymity. And so this talks of ID verification, even though I'm, of course, face docs on Twitter. The talks of ID verification, it's very troublesome. And it's something to definitely keep an eye on while we're, in this sort of high spirits. It looks like definitely one of the things that's interesting to perhaps consider is, not much has really changed within the coding of, Twitter itself, or really any sort of policy outright, even though I think it seems that a lot of people who were banned are coming back, or just simply wanted to return to the platform. A lot of people could have returned to the platform, but they just didn't have the energy for it, and now this sort of energy has reemerged because they think that they'll get a more fair shake in this, potentially new possibility out of these events. I think that perhaps the best example, is the idea of when you would have a big party as a child, or when you were in college or something. Nobody knew that it was going to be a big party necessarily, but you guys all agreed that it was going to be a big party. And so, that sort of energy, that sort of momentum will carry itself into actually coming out, tangibly. And so, it's important to understand, perhaps, or realize how much goodwill overall does play a role, and that sort of will plays a role in how the appearances of the world are to you. And so, this sort of goodwill, not being so black-pilled, or whatever the case may be. I believe that it will attract that sort of thing to you. And so, these sort of events or opportune moments, I think, come from, our goodwill, our good nature to have discourse, these things that we, stand up for and not forget about within our identity. But one of the things I've been mowing over lately, and I made a whole video about it, my last one, is this sort of abstraction between, realist metaphysics, trying to see the world for what it is something that's, deep within this sort of conservative ethos that we all sort of care about. Seeing things for what they are, a spade for a spade, as it were. and on the other side you have, appearances of the virtual, going away from things like the material. We've talked about before on the channel about materialism and its lack of dominance in today's world, or lack of reverence, and sort of its causality and its principles towards our sensory output. What does that change about our metaphysics as a whole, and what do we make of realism, if there is anything left to make of it? And this is, I think, perhaps one of the largest priorities to deal with in the 21st century, is this dichotomy of realist metaphysics, natural order, and virtual and its appearances. But I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I also wanted to top off with another look at relationships between gender and family as a whole. Is something that I care about a lot, and I think the recent Depp trial was rather eye-opening, it seems, for a lot of people not so much more in our scene, but more independent people who aren't as in tune, if you will. And it's kind of interesting to see their reaction, because it's something that I think all men really feel deep down, whether or not they admit it or not, when they looked at this trial, or if they cared to give a glance at it, an honest glance at it. Is ultimately how it took someone with Depp's resources and influence to be able to overcome this situation for him, with himself, and in a lot of ways it actually played a role in him being in this situation to begin with. But I don't really want to focus so much on that, as it is the feeling among, I think, most men looking on, and realizing that the deck is very much stacked against you, and it's thrown in your face quite literally when they talk about or when you're told about taking a bite, or sitting down or whatever for other voices, for other people. This wasn't just this isn't just sloganeering. This is quite literal. These people are playing for keeps, and seeing men react to this sort of bureaucracy at hand against them, and knowing that this is systemic with the fracture of gender relations as a whole with women. Whether or not they actually want to say this out loud, of course, I think most men, deep down, consider this at night, at least most honest men. But to top it off, and I think perhaps to end this video, because I think it'll be a very important topic in the next one that I do a couple months from now, is looking at, if you will, that sort of realist event that could really knock our love for the virtual, if you will, or at least change it with these sort of global food shortages that we're beginning to see, and crisis as a whole. One of the things I'm concerned of course, is that our love for virtual and its sort of perception of reality, and its soothing of the senses with giving you whatever you want at all times. A global food crisis, of course, will knock the realism back into us, if you will. And seeing Goya Foods CEO warned that there is a global crisis on the way. It doesn't bode well, especially for client nations across the third world who will be displaced and likely will be used as pawns to filter back into democratic states in the first world to use as voting blocks. But yeah, this is just another generalities video, and I wanted to wrap it up here before we go back to philosophy on the channel with Whitehead. But yeah, thanks for watching, guys. Consider following me on Twitter at Bongo Bongerson, and subscribe to my YouTube and BitChute channel. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed.